on behalf of all of us gathered here this evening, it is my privilege to invite Sir Nick Clegg to the podium to receive the Peter Sutherland Leadership Award.
Well, Francis, thank you very, very much for that extraordinarily generous introduction. It's downhill from here, I can guarantee you. I'm not going to live up to that billing, but I really am very grateful to you. I'm grateful to you, Ian, and your team for hosting us this evening, to you, Seamus, and your team at KPMG for supporting it, to Peter and UNICEF for reminding us of the wonderful cause that you represent, to all the nominees, to all the winners, to all the partners, the other sponsors, to my fellow honorees, Willie Mullins, and of course the late and great Tony Riley, and of course to the family members of Peter Sutherland. I really am very, very grateful to be here, and it is an immense privilege for me to receive an award in honour of Peter Sutherland. I spent a very formative period of my life studying and working in Brussels in the 1990s, which was the heyday of the European and international institutions, which Peter did so much to build. And in a sense, it was also Europe that brought my wife, Miriam, and I together. Not only did I meet Miriam as a student at the College of Europe, we both worked for several years in the European Commission. She for Chris Patten and me for Leon Britton. Two men very much forged from similar ideological quarry and waistline as Peter. It was also, at that time, was the high point of globalization and of European integration. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Single European Act was bedding in, the Maastricht Treaty was hot off the presses, and the WTO was up and running. So for people like Miriam and myself, Peter Sutherland really was one of the towering figures of that time. I last saw Peter just 3 days before he suffered a heart attack on his way to Mass at the Brompton Oratory Church in London in September 2016. It was a heart attack from which he sadly never fully recovered. And yet the ideas that we discussed at the time when we met of the virtues of international partnership, of leadership across borders, and of the strength of open trading economies they are ideas as valuable as they are unfashionable in many places today. Some might claim that the thinking of Peter and his generation of leaders is now just an interesting subject for historians. But I strongly suspect, as the world is now going to embark upon a new experiment of protectionism, that we will learn the enduring lesson of history, that erecting trade barriers always leaves people poorer and is often a handmaiden to tension and conflict between nations. And I think it will be the spirit of Peter Sutherland and others which will, over time, continue to win out. For me, the European cause isn't just a political ideology, it's my identity. My mother is Dutch. As a young girl, she'd been a prisoner in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Indonesia. My father has Russian heritage. His mother and her family fled the Bolshevik Revolution. Miriam is a proud Spaniard, as if there's such a thing as non-proud Spaniards, and we have raised our 3 boys in a bilingual home. In fact, I'm so European that while I was the British Deputy Prime Minister, the Mail on Sunday ran an unforgettable headline: "Is there anything British about Nick Clegg?" And they even put the word anything in capital letters in case you missed it. And I'm sure Peter, also an ardent European, would have been as disheartened as I am by the economic stagnation and political rudderlessness we see across too much of Europe today. Europe has lost its way economically and politically. In my view, much of that, not all of it, much of what we're contending with can be traced back to the crippling financial crash of 2008 that left millions of people hurt by what happened and what appeared to them to be a terrible failure of freewheeling global elites. We're still dealing with the backlash today, and we should not underestimate how out of touch many governing institutions have appeared ever since. And yet, history has also taught us that the European cause is often reimagined and reasserted in response to crisis. Ireland's post-crisis prosperity and political stability, on display again in last week's election, is an example for others. My Dutch great-grandfather was a punctilious chemist who had a somewhat eccentric love of circuses. And he stayed in the Netherlands during the war and endured the humiliation of Nazi occupation. In the summers afterwards, he would often take my mother on driving holidays across France in a clunky old Citroën he had at the time. And my mother describes how, if he ever found himself driving behind a German car, he would always overtake it as a matter of principle, refusing point blank to sit patiently behind a German, even if they were on a dangerous hairpin bend halfway up a mountain. Yet, like many citizens of the founding member states, he saw the European community as a means of moving on, of reconciliation, a triumph of peace over war, a turning of the page on an ugly and violent past. And as my mother also points out, one of his closest friends was a German circus impresario who would bring his family circus to Amsterdam every year. So yes, Europe is in a state of crisis. But as with other far worse crises our continent has endured, I firmly believe that this is also an occasion to bring Europe closer together. We are a cluttered and compressed continent with a dizzying array of histories, languages, and cultures jostling cheek by jowl. And in the end, history tells us, just as it told my great-grandfather, there is no alternative but to turn enmity into amity across our continent. Now, one encouraging sign over recent months is that the penny appears to have dropped, and there is now widespread recognition that Europe must throw off the shackles of misplaced and convoluted regulation, generate more wealth to ensure that we can defend ourselves and not always depend on Uncle Sam, and above all, deepen the single market rather than fragmenting it. In the economic sector that I know best, 77, would you believe it, 77 new pieces of EU digital legislation have been passed and adopted since 2019 alone. And yet, the single market remains incomplete. It is striking that a digital startup today in Dublin would still have to navigate 27 different intellectual property laws, various rules for the licensing of content, different data protection authorities, and jump through other hoops before it could operate across the continent. The single market remains Europe's biggest asset, but we need to finish the job. We need to create the scale that the single market promised but hasn't yet delivered, especially when it comes to the modern digital economy. Like Peter Sutherland, as Francis says, I've moved between politics and business. And having spent time at the likes of BP and Goldman Sachs, Peter clearly wasn't shy about companies that courted a fair degree of controversy. And likewise, I'm aware that my current role at the heart of US big tech makes me something of a fox in the henhouse, given the big US platforms' well-reported issues with our regulators, some of whom are here in this wonderful city of Dublin. Now, I certainly won't dare to make any claims about what Peter would or would not think about big tech. But I feel sure that if you were here today, seeing Europe stagnating and the stitches of the globalized world slowly being pulled apart, he would not sit on the sidelines complaining. He would be leading through argument and persuasion, seeking ways to bring people together through a time of difficulty. To save itself, the European project needs people who are prepared to think big and act boldly. Peter never hesitated to do that. And in the years ahead, we will all need a bit of Peter's spirit to pull Europe through. Thank you very much indeed.